Um, Welcome to the MPMA webinar on teaching tough topics. My name is Anna Studstill, and I am going to start us off. And I'm going to be talking specifically about teaching about Black history and segregation from a small history museum. So, to introduce myself, if I knew how slideshows worked, there we go. Sorry. Um, Justin, I'm getting a little bit of feedback, I think, on you,
Oh,
if you don't mind. Thank you. Sorry about that. So, my name is Anna Studstill, and I am the Director of Education at the Edmond Historical Society and Museum. What you can see here is me doing a story time with stuffed animals. So, I'm in charge of all of our educational programming from stuffed animals, programs for kids to programs for adults, and everything in between. I have worked in history museums and museums in general for over 10 years now. Um, I've worked at mostly history sites, but I have a few art museum and natural history museum backgrounds too. Um, I have a master's in secondary education and another in historical administration. And I really got interested in teaching about kind of tough topics when I worked at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, where I worked on my thesis on teaching about race at historic sites. Um, I moved to Oklahoma and started working at my current site. And I also really love memes. So I have this meme in here that I think really represents kind of some of our history pushback really well. So I have done research on like how issues on race have been taught in the past in museums and classrooms, but I'm not really going to get a chance to touch on that today. I'm very interested in it though, so I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about it more in depth with anyone one on one. A little bit of background on my site. We are a small ish historical society in a suburb of Oklahoma City. We do have 5 full-time staff members, which is why I say small ish versus just small. So we're not big, but we're not teeny tiny. When I first started, we really did not have a ton of conversations about race at all. Our city itself was founded as part of the land run. We had a separate black school in Edmond from 1892 to 1905. And in 1905, it was closed due to insufficient numbers. And we have heard stories, rumors that in the early 1900s is when the last black family was asked to leave Edmond. At that point, it became a mostly all white town. Uh, even though even early Edmond, there were no black settlers in the city limits. There still were plenty of homesteaders who considered themselves Edmond residents who lived outside of the city. One of our most frequently asked questions is, was Edmond a sundown town? And a sundown town is a town which did not allow Black people or people of color to be in the town after sundown. We have enough firsthand accounts to know that there was something enforcing this, but there was no official sundown law on the books. And I'll get into some of those firsthand accounts a little bit later. There were racially restrictive covenants in Edmond restricting Black families from owning homes. Uh, the first Black student was admitted to the local university in the early 1950s. And then the first Black professor started at that university in 1970, and that is when I believe the first Black family moved into town. I tell you all of this because since we were a sundown town, um, or uh, there weren't as many Black families living here, I think it sometimes makes it harder for us to confront our history. The white people who lived in Edmond during the 50s and 60s don't remember it being segregated. They don't remember those images of segregation that you think of when you think of like deep South Mississippi. So they don't think of it as a segregated town when really it was just more uh, in the fabric of the town. So it just is different, and I think that especially the people who lived here during that time have a little harder time coming to terms with it. Um, Also, our population, the population of our suburb, increased tremendously when busing was implemented in Oklahoma City, which is the city next to us. And so that has a part of our history and is important to talk about. Um, like I said, we don't have those images of segregation like you see in, your classic history textbook. So we had to be a little more um, when we talk about it, when I talk about it, I have to be a little more discerning or creative about what we use. So this artifact, this is a pre-COVID picture, actually probably like 3 weeks before COVID last year. So that's why there's no mask. I just have to say that because I find it a little horrifying to look at right now. Uh, so this film projector is from a local movie theater, and on the inside, uh, right here, it's hard to see. Projectionists who worked at that movie theater signed it. Well, one of the projectionists was a man named Buzz Forsyth who lived here in Edmond. And in the early 1950s, he remembers working at this theater and a black man coming into the city, coming into the movie theater, and being asked to leave by the police because it was after sundown. And this really had an impact on Buzz, that man's like life, because he saw it and just was outraged at how unfair that was. Um, we also have images from the Chamber of Commerce. This is a 1942 image that was advertising moving to Edmond, and it says 6,000 alert citizens, no Negroes. So this is how Edmond, how our city was advertising itself to other people in Oklahoma. Um, we also have this image, which is a KKK rally that happened in our city. So this is an image that we have borrowed from the Oklahoma History Center and used. Um, because of that kind of we haven't focused on this history in the past. We have had to look at for these stories a little bit more. This is an online exhibit that we're currently working on called Edmund's African American History. This exhibit is a long time in the making. The particular exhibit we wrote as part of a larger traveling exhibit, and it was specifically talking about schools and integration, but we have expanded it to be more, to tell more of the story. And it's we've been working on it since this past summer to turn it into an online exhibit. Um, we are having more people review it than normal, than we normally would an exhibit because our staff is all white. We felt it was important to have some African American community members take a look at this exhibit and give us their feedback. Um, this is kind of a look at what it's going to cover. It only goes into the 1970s just because we had to end it. Otherwise, we would have spent forever researching before we got it online, which we already are. So um, now I'm going to go into kind of tips for tackling it at your museum, just things that I have learned from working at a small site and talking about this. And I want to start with this quote that I heard recently from Stephen Seals, who is the Community Outreach Liaison and Program Development Manager at Colonial Williamsburg. And I just realized I have a typo in this. But I heard him say, equity looks like inequity for people who have always had equity. And I think that it really resonated with me because I think that a lot of the kind of angry comments or pushback you might get from talking about these subjects kind of delve into that idea. So the first thing that I want to start with the tips is that um, your intent behind what you say is not greater than your impact. So maybe I use a term or a phrase that is out of date and considered offensive now. If someone tells me that, if someone says, this offends me, it's not on me to argue that they shouldn't be offended by what I said. What I would say is, "I'm so sorry. Thank you for letting me know, and I will adjust my phrasing from now on." And I think that that is just important to know when you're thinking about talking about these things. Uh, I think the easiest way to do this is just to start. There are a lot of resources out there, and if you just start telling these stories, uh, you'll have an easier time continuing it. Um, and don't be afraid to change and adapt. So you might have noticed I used the term black at the start of my talk when I was talking about history, but that exhibit that I mentioned is called Edmund's African American History. And that's something that the community members told us, although many of them identify as black, they thought African American was a um, more better, ugh, that's not a word, but was a more encompassing term for specifically the time period we're talking about in the early 1900s. And so we made that change, and that's okay. We spent a lot of time debating it, and I felt very strongly that we should be consistent with what we use. And then turns out like it's fine to switch back and forth. That's okay if it's appropriate in one situation. Um, you can change it. Uh, Another thing is uh, to write it into your scripts and programs. If you write in these topics into what you're already doing, it's much easier to talk about. For example, that movie projector story I told you, part of why I use that story all the time is because that movie projector is always on display in the gallery because it is very hard to move. And so I know that if I'm going to talk about this subject, I can always talk about it with that projector in the gallery. Um, and there are a lot of ways to do this age appropriately. So, one thing that I really hear a lot that really bothers me sometimes is that, oh, I only teach, this grade. I only teach third grade. That's all we see at our museum. I don't I can't talk about this because they're too young. They're not too young. If they are there talking about, especially if you're a history site, but even if you're not, if they're talking about other topics, um, they can learn about these things. I'm not saying you need to do it, go in depth into something that is not age appropriate, but there are age appropriate resources out there. Look at what they're already covering in there. And again, history, so social studies standards, look at what they're talking about and how you can adapt that to what you have. Um, this is a great resource. They previously were called teachingtolerance.org, but now they're learningforjustice.org. And they have so many lesson plans, so many great opportunities. There's also a website called Conscious Kid that has storybooks and things for even younger ages. And I put together a resource list, which I will share in the chat when I am done talking, for some of these things so that you can find these resources easier. If you write it into your scripts and your programs automatically, it makes it much easier to, it's not what I wanted. It makes it much easier to kind of uh, be clear about how you want it addressed with other parties, and it helps with your training. So when you train your staff or your volunteers on talking about these topics, I kind of tend towards giving my volunteers as many resources as I possibly can for talking about this to make them feel confident. So one of the things that I do is try to put together like frequently asked comments, frequently asked questions, how to deal with that. Uh, One of our biggest comments or criticisms with talking about um, uh, race in our gallery is, oh, this happened in the past, so it doesn't matter anymore. We got that a lot when we had that KKK uh, picture on display because that does foster a lot of emotions. So my snarky answer, if I was not prepared to answer this nicely, my snarky answer for someone saying, "Oh, this is in the past. Why are we talking about this?" would be, Our whole museum is a history museum. Literally everything is in the past. So that is not a useful comment. Um, but obviously, I'm not going to say that to, I would say that to like a friend, but I wouldn't say that. I try not to say that to a visitor. My non snarky answer is usually something about, well, this is part of Edmond's history. And if we don't talk about all parts, both the good and the bad, we miss seeing the full story of our community. And also, this history does still impact Edmond today. We are still a fairly white community, and some of that has to do with this history. Um, we also work with other sites if they're further along in telling this story. I think it's helpful to reach out to other sites, other places to see what they have to offer. And as I mentioned before, reach out to community members. So, the people that we had review our exhibit are people that are already invested in the museum and have been extremely helpful in telling their stories for us. Question that um, I kind of touched on, but dealing with angry visitors. One way that I try to do that is to kind of prep people before they come or when they're here that we're going to be talking about some of these topics. Again, particularly if you're talking about something or looking at something that might have a lot of emotions. Um, One of the things that I actually find more difficult than dealing with angry visitors, because if someone is angry, there are tips for dealing with confrontational visitors out there. I've seen a lot recently on like masked or unmasked trainings that you can utilize for confrontational visitors, but a lot of it is de escalating the situation. But what I have a harder time with is kind of well meaning comments that are in fact racist at their heart. um, I those microaggressions are sometimes harder to deal with. I feel like because the person who is saying it could get angry, but it is important, and I feel like it's important for me as someone who is white to call out those things. So I deal with those aggressions or that anger versus someone else. And so what I try to do is kind of uh, just identify the misconception or the part of that comment that is problematic. So one thing that we get a lot is I mentioned that we didn't have those images you see in like the deep south. I'm sorry, I keep dunking on Mississippi. I don't mean to do that. Those deep south images you see. So a lot of people will say, well, it wasn't bad here, or it wasn't as bad here, so like it's fine. But what I say is I reference those images we looked at earlier and talk about how it was still here, it was just in a different kind of more in our format way, um, and kind of explain what it means and why that comment could come across as the impact that comment might have versus just the intent. And just try and like get out of the conversation or steer it away as you're dealing with it. Um, the final thing I wanted to talk about is kind of fostering empathy within these conversations. So uh, there are studies that show that you can inspire empathy with storytelling, but it's easier to inspire that empathy when you focus on individual stories and experiences. And I have seen that in our tours. When I tell that story about Buzz and the young man who came into the movie theater and was escorted out, people get outraged. People really have a strong reaction to it about the unfairness of it. But if I just stand up there and say, Edmond was a sundown town. If you were black, you were escorted out on sundown. People don't have that same reaction. That's not to say that they're like, whatever, but the visceral reaction isn't there. So storytelling, fostering on individual experiences, sensory rich experiences can help increase empathy. I don't have as many options for doing that here, but if you do something that people really experience, can foster that empathy. And then I wanted to touch on this, which is the arc of dialogue. And it's a way to foster empathy through kind of dialogue questions. And this would be for if you're focusing on this as a tour with a small group, you could do something like this. And you start by asking non threatening questions, share personal experiences, slightly more challenging questions, then explore experience of others is we questions, and then finally you end with kind of synthesizing and summary. So this is all that I had for my piece of this. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to show two more memes to end, just to end on a funny note. I thought this one was appropriate because I know that happens to me often. And then this just made me laugh. But I'm going to turn it over to Claire Robinson from the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And we'll save questions until the very end. So we have three speakers today. So let's stop screen sharing and turn it over to you, Claire.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you all today. My name is Claire Robinson, and I am the Senior Museum Educator at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And I'm looking right now to share my screen for you all and make sure my PowerPoint's up. I would just like to get a yes from someone. Can y'all see what I'm saying? Thank you, Anna. Okay, so I am the Senior Museum Educator at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. I work directly under our Director of Education, Dr. Charlotte DeCoster, and we deal with everything education-wise, right? Building the curriculum, building our lesson plans, training teachers to be able to teach this content in their classrooms, training our docents, creating our field trip experiences, creating our lessons, our programs that we give to students, recently creating all of our virtual field trip experiences in this world that we now live in. And before I was at the museum, I've been with the museum for about 3 years. I was a secondary history teacher. So I taught 8th grade in the local school districts around Dallas. So that's kind of my background. I don't know how much you all know about our museum, but we are actually fairly new in this space. Our original museum, however, does have more history. It was founded in the 1980s by a group of local Holocaust survivors who live in Dallas. And it was very tiny. It basically was in the basement of the Jewish Community Center here in Dallas. And it had a memorial room, which our survivors made as really a place of remembrance that they could go to memorialize their family members who were lost during the Holocaust. And it had a boxcar, and that was it. I mentioned the boxcar is something our museum and our survivors are very proud of, that we were the first museum to have a boxcar. A little known fact, now any Holocaust museum you go to has a boxcar, but our survivors wheeled and dealed that somehow to get it over here in the 80s, and they're very, very proud of that. So it was very small, and then in 2005, we moved into a downtown rented space, about 2,000 square feet. It was, the exhibit was focusing on one day in the Holocaust. So a very tiny exhibit, but rich with artifacts and testimony. And then in 2019, we actually created a whole new museum. So our old museum is at the bottom of this building over here, and we got the lot across the street and really expanded, created a whole new Holocaust exhibit, but also expanded our whole mission. So we are now the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. This was something very important to not only our community when we asked for community input, but really our survivors about extending that message of lessons and what we learned from the Holocaust to human rights, modern human rights today. And so that's kind of how that transition went along. So we opened in September 2019. We're now in this 55,000 square foot building. So a big change here. Our exhibit, we have, even though our Holocaust and human rights, we only have one permanent exhibit. It is all connected. So we don't have, like, you don't go to two different parts to see human rights and the Holocaust. It flows together and it's connected, and that was very intentional from our survivors wanted that. So our first wing is our Holocaust wing, which of course we focus on the history of the Holocaust. Then it goes right into our human rights wing, which discusses what happens with the idea of human rights after the Holocaust, right? And this begins with the Nuremberg trials and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? If we have these human rights violations, then what are our human rights? And has our 10 stages of genocide gallery, which goes into the educational and awareness tool of the process of genocide and identifying what genocide looks like as an awareness tool, so we can identify if countries or governments are on the verge of committing a genocide. And then we end with our Pivot to America wing here, which really focuses on American civil and human rights. And it focuses on 12 different strands of American history. And the idea is really broken down into what we call American ideals, reality, and repair. So America was founded on these really revolutionary ideals, right? All men are created equal. Crazy idea in 1776. Great idea. However, our historical reality doesn't match up to that ideal, right? There's American slavery. Women don't have the right to vote until the 20th century. There's countless examples of our historical reality not matching up to these ideals that are written down at the founding of our country. But there are these amazing people in American history who stood up to drive change, to try to repair our society, to try to get us closer to these ideals. And so that's what really this whole gallery deals with. So it's kind of an overview of our museum and what we offer. It's kind of a big span of topics. Obviously, all these topics are not daisies and sunshine, right? These are hard histories. They're tough things to talk to not only just students about, but any visitor about, right? Anybody about. And so the way that we talk with our students, set up our field trips, and set up all of our educational resources is very intentional to try to kind of break that barrier down of I'm uncomfortable to how can we get into this hard history and what can we learn from that. So really the basis, what I use when I'm creating materials and I'm trying to make connections for students, is I really rely on this social emotional learning system, also probably from my teaching background here, but from Castle, and the link is down there at the bottom, and I'll add more of my resources to Anna's list because I haven't added them all yet. So I will put them on that spreadsheet. But the Castle system for social emotional learning is basically just the process through which children and adults, basically all of us, understand and manage our emotions, how we set and achieve our positive goals, how we show empathy for others, how we feel empathy, and how we establish and maintain positive relationships and make those responsible decisions, right? And social emotional learning is so easily interwoven in when teaching history, right? It's kind of the perfect platform to interweave these topics, right? And our wheel here kind of breaks this down for us. We can see the self-management, self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making. And then you see on the outside, right, this is really fostered by classrooms. So in their schools, the school in general, right? And then homes and communities. And that's where we all really fall in, right? As museums and providing this content for our community and for the students who are therefore affected by what we are offering to our community. And so thinking on this SEL, social emotional learning kind of train, is how we like to deliver those resources to our students, kind of breaking through that barrier of teaching a tough topic is using these tools to get this information across for our students. And so one of the main ways that we do that in our exhibit is by discussing human behavior, right? When we look at history and learn about history, it might seem kind of easy for students to want to know like everything that is like it's black and white and there's no gray area, right? But that's not how we are as humans. Human behavior is very flux. And so kind of studying history in that lens of studying human behavior and how people make decisions can help students understand history a little bit better. So, right, everybody has personal choice. And that's really what we dive into when we're talking about the history of the Holocaust. It is not just the Nazis and Hitler who end up murdering 6 million European Jews. That's just impossible. That small group of people. The Holocaust and genocides in general rely on collaborators, rely on bystanders, right? That bystander behavior. They rely on people to sit there and do nothing and say nothing. So that's what we really try to get across to students through our museum is being a bystander isn't taking yourself out of the situation. It's a very active role. You're choosing to do nothing, right? You're in that position, you're in that scenario, you're seeing what's going on, you're seeing something wrong, and you choose to do nothing. And in turn, that helps the perpetrator, right? So what we do try to instill in our students is kind of the opposite of that, and this term that we use of upstander, and being an upstander instead of a bystander. And we have kind of 3 parts for our upstander definition. The first part is somebody who stands up for other people and their rights. This is a big part of the Holocaust. If you've heard of, the Righteous Among the Nations award that the Israel Museum Yad Vashem gives out. This award is for Gentiles who, risked their lives, careers, or took some risk to save Jews. So basically, you're not being impacted by this, discrimination or persecution. However, you see that it's happening to other people and you do something about it. It's something that we kind of call rescuers in the exhibit. The second part of that is somebody who just combats injustice, inequality, or unfairness. And we like to add that part in because we do want students to understand that you can be an upstander for yourself, right? You don't need somebody else to stand up for you. You can, we want them to have the agency to stand up for themselves as well and advocate for themselves. So you're just combating any injustice, anything that's unequal or unfair, whether that's for somebody else or yourself, right? And then lastly, this part I think kind of just encompasses the whole idea of being an upstander is just somebody who sees something wrong and works to make it right. And that's really the most simple explanation. You're in a situation, something is wrong, you do something, right? You make a choice to help, to say something, to tell somebody else, to take action, right? It's that opposite of being a bystander. And here's where we usually use this quote by Einstein: "The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing," right? So he's saying, the percentage of those people who are outwardly evil, or if we even think about it in different terms, right? That explicit bias, right? Those very obvious acts of racism or prejudice or anti-Semitism, that group of people is smaller compared to the people who stand by and do nothing and allow it to happen, or the people who have those implicit biases, right? It's not so obvious, but it's there. And so we want our students to understand those differences and to understand that if you aren't speaking up and trying to make things right, then you fall under that side of aiding or helping a perpetrator, in another situation, aiding or helping a bully, kind of whatever situation you want to be talking about there. And so throughout our entire Holocaust wing, all of the people who were upstanders during the Holocaust are highlighted in red. So red is that color, it's popping out on every single panel. Some panels are totally in red because we've listed a bunch of upstanders. There are some countries who are listed as upstanders. We have a whole section on Jewish resistors, right? Those upstanders who stood up for themselves, resisted for themselves. And so that red kind of pops out to them. It draws the students in. That's the only thing in our museum that's in this color. And we did that for a reason, so that it's loud and it's obvious and that students are continuously seeing it as they go through. The Holocaust, I think a lot of students have told me in the past, like, this is just so depressing, right? They're like, I don't know how much I can take in. So sprinkling these upstander moments throughout the story, sprinkling in these people who took risks to save others in spite of all the evil that was happening, right? Really, I think helps students carry on, helps them stay motivated to keep hearing the story instead of just checking out like, this is just awful, the world's an awful place and I don't even want to deal with it, right? Hearing those positive stories and seeing those upstander behavior moments, and in this, it could be the smallest act, right? But it's man's best examples of humanity to man instead of man's worst examples of inhumanity to man, right? And so we want our students to kind of stick with the learning, and by showing these examples of people, I think really helps them help process this information. Same within our last wing, our Pivot to America wing. That entire wing is about American history upstanders. So it's about people who stood up for Asian American rights, Tejano rights, African American rights, women's rights, children's rights, immigrants' rights. We have all these different topics that are in these interactive stations where students can kind of choose a topic that is of interest to them, and it has a historical timeline filled with all of these people who were upstanders and who drove change to help that community get more towards our ideals of our country, right? That equality, right? Or equity. And so that whole exhibit is upstander behavior as well. So it's a really big kind of cornerstone of our museum. So some examples, obviously, of our upstanders here. You can see some of these are from the Holocaust. Some of these are our American history upstanders. Some of them are American history, yet we're upstanders in the Holocaust too, like LBJ here, who actually, just an interesting side note, if you're interested, when he was a young Texas congressman, ran kind of charged a secret mission to allow European Jews to immigrate through the coast of Texas and find refuge in America, that bypassed all of those quota immigration laws. So called Operation Texas. So a good, proud Texas moment there. We can take what we can get. But so we highlight our upstanders throughout our entire exhibit, whether it's in our Holocaust wing or our American history wing, giving these personalized stories for students to hear and to grab onto. So as well as highlighting our upstanders and giving those stories, part of our docent training, of course, is to highlight our upstanders, but also we really encourage our docents to use the survivor testimony, right? Our exhibit is filled with survivor testimony that students can pick up and listen to, or visitors can pick up and listen to. There are 17 different stations throughout the Holocaust wing with 4 different survivors on each of them. And so one of the things that we tell our docents is utilize that, right? We don't know what it was like to be a Jew being persecuted during the Holocaust, right? We don't know what it was like to have our whole family murdered. So we don't want to try to say that we know what it's like, right? It's best to let the survivors and the people who have experienced it to speak for themselves and to tell that story themselves. And so to really utilize that survivor testimony, I think Anna hit on this as well, right? Those personal stories are what students connect with and what students are going to remember, right? 6 million Jews were murdered. That is such a big number. Our brains, even as adults, can't really grasp that, the magnitude of that. But I do remember from growing up, the survivor who came and spoke at my school every year, right? Like I know his story and I remember what happened to him, and that's what really affects me. And so using these survivor testimonies, using testimonies for whichever history you're talking about, letting the history kind of speak for itself, I think is a really great tool as well. You're not trying to talk for somebody else or for somebody's experience, especially if you're not from that same background. So the use of testimony and teaching these tough topics, as well as a lot of our docent training, which Anna also mentioned, is, how to deal with visitors when, they say something that's a little off color or a little political. Especially in our museum, we get a lot of political comments, right? Comparing Nazi Germany to whatever situation we are in today. And so We have to do a lot of kind of role-playing scenarios in our docent training with those political conversations about how to kind of redirect the conversation, right? Yes, I am so glad that you are making connections. That's what history is. It's making connections to our lives now and things in the past, right? But always keep in mind that, you know, Nazi Germany is completely different than, you know, 21st century America, right? So validating a thought by a visitor, but then kind of bringing it back around. Other examples are in our museum, or we get a lot of students or visitors making comments that actually go into Holocaust denial or other genocides denial without really even thinking about it. Again, it's not so explicit, it might be more implicit. For example, one of our genocides we discussed in our 10 Stages of Genocide gallery is of the Karankawa Indians in Texas, along the coast of Texas. The Karankawas were murdered out by Stephen F. Austin's colonizing group when they came to settle Texas for the white Protestant settlers. But one of the comments that I received, I was doing professional development out in East Texas one year, and one of the teachers said to me, well, the Karankawa were cannibals, and so they had to be, you know, it was, you know, us, it was Stephen F. Austin or them, right? And that's a form of denial. And that's exactly what Stephen F. Austin used to dehumanize the Karankawas by saying things that they're cannibals. The Karankawa were actually a coastal tribe. They didn't even eat red meat. They only ate fish and berries. So examples like that, like people will have comments that go into denial and how to deal with that. And really when it's comments like that, it's best to call it out for what it is, right? So when I get those comments from teachers, well, actually, if we look at, you know, the facts of the Karankawa, they only ate fish and berries. They were a coastal tribe. They didn't even ever eat red meat. And so that's a falsehood. And that was part of the dehumanization process of the Karankawa Indians, right? Fixing that that misconception right when you see it, right? Or else that perpetuates. So going into all of that training for our docents, and then also training for our educators when we go out and give professional development across Texas. Lastly, I would say another great tool for teaching tough topics is using your connections. Again, you are not going to have everyone at your museum or your library that knows everything, right? You're not going to have the experts on it all, and you shouldn't, right? So using your connections of people who can help, right? Who we can point visitors to if they have questions about a specific topic. So at the end of our Pivot to America gallery, the end of our exhibit, we actually have a call to action gallery where we have all of these volunteer organizations, all of these organizations who deal with a plethora of topics that have been brought up in our gallery. So basically these organizations we've partnered with, visitors can search through, they can find an organization that interests them, and they can actually sign up to volunteer with that organization. Their email goes directly to the volunteer coordinator at that organization, and anytime there's a volunteer opportunity, they'll be on that mailing list from then on. So we might not have all the answers about, you know, a specific topic that is in our exhibit or in our Pivot to America gallery, but we did make connections with local and national organizations who that's their main subject, right? That's what they do every single day, and they're the experts on that. And we want to connect our visitors to the experts. Our Disrupting Racism Toolkit over the summer, this is something that we ended up creating for our teachers and visitors to talk about how to talk about race with kids. Again, we aren't the experts on that, so we went to people who are, and we listed their organizations in our toolkit and their websites and where you can go to find more information from people who talk about how to talk about race with kids every single day, right? And giving them their platform. Our current special exhibition, The Fight for Civil Rights in the South, of course, it's a traveling exhibition. It's not ours, it's from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. However, we did want to bring it a little closer to home and to make it more Dallas. So we reached out to the African American Museum in Fair Park here in Dallas. We reached out to a couple of our local universities here who had some civil rights libraries on their campus and who had artifacts from the Jim Crow era here in North Texas, right? So we incorporated, this is a photographic exhibit of Selma and the Freedom Rides. And so in addition to those photographs, we incorporated local artifacts that represent that era right here in North Texas. And we didn't have all of those, but we reached out to the people who did to kind of make that happen and bring that to our visitors. So knowing that you can't be the expert on everything and going to the people who are and using your connections. And that is all I have on my end. I hope I didn't talk too long, but I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen now and I will turn it on over to LaDonna.
Chogma, so Hochifoet LaDonna Brown, Chicasa Shaya, Mija, Chicasha Iagni Tuxalili. Hello, my name is LaDonna Brown, and I am Chickasaw, and I work for the Chickasaw Nation. I served as the Director of Research and Cultural Interpretation and the Heritage Preservation Division here at the Chickasaw Nation. I appreciate the opportunity to speak regarding Chickasaw culture and methods our division uses to teach culture and history. So I was given some specific questions sent by the museum committee discussing some of these ideas. And so I just want to go through those questions and answer those questions. Unfortunately, I didn't prepare a presentation or anything. So I don't have any slides or anything. So you're going to have to look at me. So the first question was, how do you acknowledge the past while being relevant to the present and looking forward to the future? So in the Heritage Preservation Division, what we try to do is, our duty is to make connections from an ancient past to the modern day and be productive while progressing toward our future, toward a Chickasaw future. We believe it is very important to acknowledge and share our past to future generations of Chickasaw people, so they will know from where their identity, their cultural identity comes. Our duty as Chickasaw citizens and employees in this present time is to reinforce the understanding of cultural identity, make connections from the past to the future by continuing to reinforce the oral history, sharing ancient stories, and making connections by revealing and sharing knowledge of tangible items from our past. Our current student involvement in various Chickasaw cultural activities offers us much hope that our future is in good hands. So the next question is, how do we help teach or inspire empathy? Is it part of sharing these stories to prevent history from repeating itself? This is a very good question, and we feel like we have a very good answer. To teach our culture to a general audience, people who may not know anything about Chickasaw culture or history, or who may know very little about Chickasaw culture or history, we try to provide a universal connection. A universal connection for us means to speak on a very general topic, such as family, a pet, love, favorite food, sister relationship, brother relationship, a favorite item of sentimental value, etc. Those kinds of general things that everybody understands. And as we discuss this item or circumstance, we can relate it to an aspect of Chickasaw culture that follows along the same thought process. At the conclusion, we can compare and contrast the universal idea to the cultural tradition and the reason it is so significant. By utilizing this approach, a person can better understand a Chickasaw cultural concept by placing themselves in a relatable situation. The next question is, how have your methods changed as a result of the pandemic? And as far as sharing Chickasaw culture, our methods have not really changed. We are eager for the time when we can return to sharing, teaching, and personally engaging in our culture. We have incorporated a way to digitally share information and connect with each other as we complete our daily work task. One plan and process is to connect with a few elderly citizens who do not have the capability to connect virtually. And hopefully we can start new projects with them, even if through a phone call. And one way to do that is we call an elder, and these are, you know, usually our relatives, and we ask them if it's okay if we interview them. And so our interviews, of course, talk about ancient or ancient concepts or things that have been handed down in their families, stories that have been handed down in their families, cultural customs that have been handed down in their families. And you'll notice that when you begin to talk about these things with these elderly people, you know, it opens up their world of what they remember, things that happened. And here's a funny story that that happened along these lines. So uh, one of our staff members called a lady who is over 90 years old. And the staff member started talking about the school that she went to when she was a little girl. And as community members, we're all familiar with this school. It was a Chickasaw school, and all the students that went to school there were Chickasaw. And so it just so happens that this particular elderly lady happened to be kind of a bully when she was going to school there. And out of the information, what happened is we learned that the nickname for this elderly lady, and if you saw the elderly lady today, you would not believe the nickname. But the nickname, the name of the school was Tullahoma, and her nickname was the Tullahoma Bear. And it's because she kind of, you know, kind of bullied people, kind of, you know, picked on other kids. And so somebody in the school started calling her the Tullahoma Bear. And so it kind of stuck. And so my mom has fun. My mom is 89, and so they talk all the time. And so my mom has fun calling her and asking for the Tullahoma Bear. And of course, the lady says, you know, the bear's not here. But it was a really, really funny story that came out of that. And so, and it shows how we are eager to get back to, you know, visiting with each other in person, and how just starting these interview processes, even through just calling somebody up and beginning to learn about their lives through a phone call. We're going one step further now. Today, right now, as a matter of fact, they're having a meeting with some of these elders and teaching them about how to use Zoom so that we can get them on a Zoom, in a Zoom meeting, and interviewing them over Zoom. So we're pretty positive that that's going to work, and we see and we know how much that they're ready to engage with everybody and tell their stories. So we're really positive that that's really going to work well for us. Throughout the years, our people have evolved and adapted to these changing circumstances. And as you can tell, getting these elders up to on their knowledge about how to use Zoom, you can that shows you how flexible that our people have been with adapting to new technology. Our ancestors were able to incorporate items from different cultures and introduce those items and or concepts into our culture. Our cultural identity was not lost by adding new items and or concepts, but reinforced and supported while at the same time engaging in traditional practices. In this particular time, it is also a way for us to evolve and adapt to the changing times. It is a part of our cultural identity to be flexible and add new items and concepts into our society. Another question is, how do you handle anything regarding politics in today's polarized world? Our citizens effectively understand the concept of politics as it relates to political organization. For thousands of years, our political process has been changed, reproduced, and reworked to help create a better society for ourselves. Our employees reinforce the values and traditions that continue to sustain our tribe and the mission to enhance the lives of all of its citizens. Because we understand this concept, we also have to be aware of politics in the overall plan of the country in which we live. This is our ancient homeland, and we will defend it as revealed by the many First American males and females who have fought for this country in many wars and battles. We are also in constant consultation with federal agencies. We have to be proactive when an issue arises that may directly or indirectly affect us. One main idea that is beneficial to us is to show unity with other tribal groups. So another question is, how can you prepare your staff who work with visitors or who do marketing to manage these conversations in person or on social media? And this is our approach. This is what we try to do. We have many employees who provide information to external audiences, whether in group presentations or individual tours. The Chickasaw Nation developed a speaker certification course that employees are required to attend prior to presenting to external audiences. Employees are trained on preferred terminology, writing styles, development of PowerPoint presentations, and general presentation skills, as well as questions they may encounter. Employees who take the speaker certification course are encouraged to research, develop a PowerPoint presentation, and draft talking points. The employee will eventually present the information to a select group of people who are knowledgeable about the required concepts. We realize sometimes that people ask about issues which are not appropriate or ask about topics that dive deeper into a subject into which the presenter has no knowledge. Employees are taught how to redirect the conversation and get back on track with the current topic. The training is very beneficial in providing our employees with the basic information to help them create and deliver the best presentation. And the situation, I feel like, where a person can really kind of get in trouble is when you're speaking about a topic that you might not, you may have researched, but you're not really real familiar with. It's something that you kind of skim the surface of, and so a little bit about it, and you can talk about it, but once the conversation gets a little bit deeper than that, you can really get into a sticky situation. And so what we try to teach our employees is in that situation, you have to stop the conversation. You have to get back to what you know. And if you're not familiar with the topic, then you just may have to say, I'm not familiar with that topic, something like that. But I wouldn't try to keep on going, because what's going to happen eventually is that, you're going to have to say, well, I just don't know anything about that, and be honest about it. Or you're going to start saying things that may or not be true, or you thought you heard it somewhere, you thought you read it somewhere, and then somebody else comes up and says, oh, that's not right at all. I don't know where you got that, but this is what we read. It's in this book. It's in this. So, don't try to go and answer things that you really, you thought you might have heard, you thought you might have read somewhere, because that can really get you into a sticky situation. And so, to give you an exact example of something that kind of happened to me, where I had to backtrack a little bit. I was presenting information over Chickasaw government, our modern day government. And one of our leaders um, was sent to federal prison. And so the next leader, the assistant leader, had to step in and take over his leadership position. And so when I was talking in my presentation, I got to that point. I didn't mention anything about that leader going off to prison. I just said the next leader took over, and then we went from there. And so one of the audience people who knew Chickasaw history very well said, "Oh, is that what we call it now?" And I said, as far as I'm concerned, that's what happened. I know you know the history, I know the history, and we don't have to say so and so went to federal prison. As far as I'm concerned, the next person took over. And Chickasaw history is good. Chickasaw political organization is good. It just, somebody made a mistake. And unfortunately, it was a bad mistake. And so, they're punished for what they did. But, we're still here, and we carried on from there. So there's situations where you got to, you know, what are you talking about, and why are you talking about it, and how are you going to talk about it in a particular way. And I think that these are some things that you kind of have to think about before you do your presentations, and make sure that you know the material you're talking about, and make sure that if there's something a little bit iffy in there, make sure that you just kind of steer around that. And and be honest with your audience. If you just really don't know, just say, I haven't got to research like I want to, but that's a really good question, really good topic, and I hope to be able to answer those questions later. We can ask so and so. But don't let your audience just there on the cliff, and that's it. Try to help them maneuver through, and both of you learn together. And that's all for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, LaDonna. And thank you also, Claire. I think that you had mentioned you had to run. So I will.
A few more minutes. I actually got pushed back to 3:10, so I can hang
Awesome.
out 3:10.
So if anyone has any questions, we're happy to take questions now. I shared the Google Doc resource in the chat already. And we can also maybe drop our email addresses if you're comfortable with that and people have questions. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, speak now. I also like just to touch on what LaDonna said at the end. It's okay to be wrong and to not know things. Like I feel like as educators, sometimes we have a hard time with that, but I don't know is a fine answer to a question that I have used many a time.
Totally agree. I think that's one of the first things I learned when I was teaching. Like, just better to tell them you don't know and
Oh, yeah.
figure it out. Then you learn something.
Because if I pretend like I know how many trains a day pass through Edmond, I know some little kid is going to school me on it if I'm wrong. All right. Well, if there are no questions, thank you everyone for coming today. And again, thank you, LaDonna and Claire, for preparing your talks.